Hello, beautiful community. So there are little green men in Belgrade, near Belgrade at least. So where have they come from and what is going on? This is a story that's made international news about the incursion of a saboteur group or several saboteur groups into that border region of Russia, and they've been announcing allegedly progress they've been making from one little village into another without resistance. So this is an extraordinarily embarrassing scenario illustrating how Russia is not able to defend its borders, and two groups have claimed responsibility for this action. Now, I think the best way for us to process what this is and what takeaways we can draw from it without me rambling too much might actually be if we just together go through a Twitter thread I've just written about it with my own commentary. So little green men are in the Belgrade area, and the Liberty of Russia Legion and the Russian Voluntary Corps have claimed responsibility for the attack. So let's put together some guiding thoughts with the help of this thread I've written. Now, do we think of these folks as being authentic partisans, or is this a Ukrainian action? Is this an action of Ukraine's military intelligence or something like that? And is the Liberty to Russia organization real? Which is to say, is it more than an extension or a product of Ukraine's military intelligence? Now, most experts don't think it's real. But let's for a moment stop and wonder what it would be like if it were real. Now, if it were real, we would call it a terror organization. And it would be not possible in all seriousness to talk about them liberating territory. Now, there is something else that's a terror organization, a really big terror organization. And what is that? That's the Putin regime. And I'm not being facetious here. I really think that it is not, at least in some contexts, explanatorily useless to call the Putin regime a terror organization. But now we've got a giant terror organization, an infinitesimal terror organization. Well, having two doesn't really make the world a better place. It doesn't really help anybody's goals. But nevertheless, this image is a useful image to keep in mind. And why is that? And that's because progressively many groups will be practicing violence on Russian territory. And just to go through these words that I've put on paper about this, because they might be useful. So I say the thing we've always said, that this is part of the vast story of the war escalating on Russian soil. We are uncertain, I say, about how that peacock's tail of violence on Russian soil will spread, but spread it shall. And I really think that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind over the months to come. And years to come, indeed, very plausibly. Whatever violence is going on now, has been going on to date on Russian soil, will both magnify in quantity and in quality. There'll be different kinds of violence going on Russian soil. That, of course, very much includes Ukraine doing more and different stuff across Russian territory, even to what we've seen so far. So that's my sort of preliminary guidance sense about what to assume this might be, right, and how to think about that. There is a second question. What are the aims of this action, if indeed it is a Ukrainian action? And I've said, and this list of course could be extended, to see the uncertainty in Russian border towns. And there was quite a bit of it. I mean, there was this extraordinary farce of the Russians playing a nuclear alert on the radio, presumably by accident or because they didn't have anything else to play, telling citizens to stay indoors in a way that's not proportionate to what's really happening, to advance Ukraine's mission of bringing war to the Russian soil. That's very important, not sufficient. Not many people understand how far that is a Ukrainian project, which Ukraine is by different means systematically pursuing. You could debate whether that project realizes Ukraine's ends, right? Because on the one hand, there's a story about how Ukraine is trying to wake up the Russian population and say, hey, the war is coming to you. This is not a television war. This is not a hybrid war. That is not something that's occurring in the informational environment. It's real. Can you see it now and wake up? Right? So that's one line. But there is another line that says, well, won't that make the Russians wake up and consolidate in extra support for Putin? And we'll analyze these two possibilities another time. And of course, to divert Russian focus from other Ukrainian operations. So, as one Russian commentator argued today, I think it is constructive to see this as, in part, a PR action. Of course, Ukraine is unlikely to conduct such operations on a much, much bigger scale because they will have the consequence of displeasing the West. I mean, if Ukraine literally took a couple of Russian towns, even if there was thinking about how that could meet some of Ukraine's interests, it's going to evoke a very uncomfortable reaction in the West that would be deleterious to Ukraine's central mission, which is sustained support. And we're going to be talking about that very seriously because I still think there's a kind of a poverty of discourse about how we need to support Ukraine after the counteroffensive, whatever the counteroffensive yields. And I believe that this is not something we should do. It's also something we should frame more clearly than we're framing now, not just at the political level, but at the level of our discourse and commentary on the war. But let's say a couple of things now about that video that got released on the Liberty to Russia Telegram channel, which I watched. Now, when I watch that video, do I think that it's real? In the sense that, do I think that it's a video by a real Russian partisan group with a message genuinely put together for the Russian population? No, I don't. I mean, that is extraordinarily difficult to think if you watch that video. So the speech sounds like a kind of concoction that would persuade a foreign audience, but nobody writing it, I said on Twitter, could reasonably expect it to pass a kind of a native bullshit detector. It's not sounding plausible as something that could be taken seriously by Z radicals or the massive depoliticized blob in the middle or the anti-Putin folks. And I said no genuine partisan group in Russia could say without evoking suspicion, which is what they say in that video, our final aspiration is Red Square. I mean, that sounds like it's going to persuade somebody of its authenticity in Seattle or Sydney, but not really in Russia. And this creates a kind of a tricky situation. How should we, a Western audience, react to this? Because there's a real danger of being given a piece of cake here and gladly accepting it. So I say we're offered a slice of cake that it is hard to resist. And that is, oh, there is partisan activity in Russia. And then we just run to that because that's such an attractive prospect. And that reaction has successfully been elicited in us across much of the internet. I recommend I recommend against it. But what is one conclusion we can take away from this? I think that in a way this is a commentary on Ukraine's superiority to Russia in the informational environment. Now, I don't want to be too generic in the way I say that, because I do think that the Russians, the Kremlin has done some really effective stuff in the informational environment. And I've said, and I'll be saying it again, that, for example, their nuclear blackmail has been a very effective informational intervention. And please know that even though it's gone today, it is not gone forever, just because allegedly the West has threatened Putin with consequences, or China has blocked this blackmail. The blackmail will be back. As soon as Ukraine succeeds sufficiently in the counteroffensive, if that indeed happens, and Mr. Putin feels vulnerable the way he did back in September 2022 when he called, without much organization, a mobilization, he's going to start threatening nuclear war left, right, and center, and more than he ever has done before. And so, last thing I say in the Twitter thread is, you, reading this now, may not be fully aware how far your pro-Ukrainian position, which I think is the correct position, is a product of Ukraine's splendid informational politics, and now we're expanding the topic beyond just this incident on the border, and Zelensky's gift for giving voice to his nation. So that is how I'd roughly look at this. I may do a live soon and take your